It took jurors less than 3 hours to decide the fate of the Texas track athlete accused of turning a high school competition into a deadly crime scene. Their verdict? Karmelo Anthony is guilty of murdering Austin Metcalf. Now Anthony knows exactly how many years he'll spend behind bars. And the moment the verdict was read, sparked powerful emotions and sobs inside the courtroom. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. Before we get started, I need to tell you about this app, Upside. It gets you cash back on everyday purchases like gas, groceries, and takeout. All you have to do is download Upside for free, claim an offer at one of their 100,000 plus locations, and pay like you normally would with your card. After that, you verify the purchase and you get money back. I use it when I get gas, or maybe I'm doing takeout one night. I search for offers on Upside. Then after I spend, money shows up in my app and I just transfer it straight to my bank. Upside's frequent users earn an average of $254 back a year. So to start getting your cash back, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on your screen and use promo code OTC to get an extra 25 cents bonus on every gallon on your first tank of gas. After Karmelo Anthony was found guilty of murder, the judge moved directly into the penalty phase. Karmelo's mom took the stand asking the court for mercy on her son. In Texas, when it comes to murder, there is a wide range of how long someone's prison sentence could be. It is between 5 and 99 years. Today, jurors not only decided that Anthony was guilty of murder, but they also determined his sentence, 35 years in prison. He's now 19. He'll be in his mid-50s when he gets out. It was an intense day in court. Cody Thomas was there throughout the entire trial, including a very, very emotional day today. Joins us now to break this down. You know, Cody, you think of just, I think there were like two major emotional moments, it seems, today, because you have the verdict where the jury finds Karmelo Anthony guilty of murder, but then you also have, after a period of time, more deliberations, and then here comes the jury deciding his sentence of 35 years. Let's start there. Like, just take us in that moment when the jury comes back with that being the sentence for Karmelo Anthony.
Yeah, Chris, obviously so. There was emotion running rampant throughout that courtroom on both sides. You know, of course, the media is sitting right behind the Metcalf family. So we saw all of those tears. You know, they feel like justice has been served for Austin Metcalf here. They feel vindicated. And of course, there were some celebratory gestures by the Metcalf friends that were in there. They looked like former teammates, five, younger, bigger guys, and a couple of girls that were in there that were sitting right behind the family. When that happened, the family turned around and gave all these kids a hug, kisses on the cheek, and the tears were just rolling between Jeff Metcalf and Megan Metcalf, the two parents there, and what I assume to be aunts, uncles, or other family friends that were there as well. Now, of course, on the other side as well, Chris, Karmelo Anthony's family, tears, but of a different token, right? You know, total opposite. Their son, their child is going to going to prison for a very long time here. He's only 19 years old, 35 years. You're not looking at getting out until 54, right? Of course, there's a parole opportunity halfway through that, 17 and a half years, but that's essentially his entire life right now. So I'm sure the emotional gravity on them that they're going to be seeing their loved one who is now a convicted murderer, through plexiglass for the next however long. So just an emotional roller coaster on both sides, a whirlwind in that courtroom, of course, Chris.
Yeah, and you think of, how stoic this family was, how Karmelo was throughout the entire trial, even through the heaviest pieces of testimony that we talked about that brought even jurors to tears. And then you just have this release in finding that you have been found guilty of murder. And then, I mean, you think at minimum, your entire life, 17 years, you're going to spend in a Texas state prison. Before we get to some of the closing arguments, which does feel like it happened days ago, it was a very busy day. There was this, part of the sentencing portion related to sudden passion and whether that is something that comes into play here. And that would have changed the potential for how many years Karmelo Anthony was going to get as a sentence. Just walk us through that part of it and how it factored into what played out in the courtroom.
Right, Chris. So this terminology, sudden passion, we hadn't heard that throughout this entire trial until today in those arguments before the jury went back there to deliberate on the sentencing. Pretty much what the defense is arguing is that this whole thing, kind of like crimes of passion that we cover here at Law&Crime and Court TV, where these sorts of instances kind of happen in the moment. You know, something's going on, heat of the moment, you make a decision. It is a clear mistake. You know, there's no arguing that it's a mistake by the defense, but the sentencing for that would have only carried 2 to 20 years versus what he was ultimately convicted of in murder and for 5 to 99 years, and of course ultimately got the 35 years. But they brought up this sudden passion thing to try to argue that this was, pretty much not premeditated. He did not go under that tent with the intention to stab anyone. This just all happened all of a sudden. But then, of course, with the prosecution reserving the right to respond, they came back and rebutted, pretty much saying, let me tell you why this isn't a sudden passion type of case here, a type of crime here. Because sudden passion, and he brought the definition up on the screen there, sudden passion involves the decedent or the victim to be the provocateur, the one who's instigating the act here. And the prosecution saying, by all of our accounts, all testimony, it was Karmelo Anthony who was the one provoking the incident. So you can't claim sudden passion if the offender was the one provoking the incident. So that's where the defense came back, or the prosecution came back. And so it was a real clash on this sudden passion thing, which ultimately the jury did not side with, convicting him of that murder, now facing 35 years behind bars.
And you think of the sudden passion part of it to argue that Austin Metcalf was the one who provoked this incident. No matter for people watching this who may have an opinion and they agree or disagree with the verdict, like by the time we were talking about sudden passion, like the guilty verdict on murder had already come in. And so like that was off the table. The jury had already we're past that point, it seems. I want to go to the closing arguments today before we get to just that moment. I'm sure just another major emotional moment when Karmelo Anthony is found guilty of murder. What did you make of the defense today? And when it came to the closing arguments before the guilty verdict today, what were kind of the bullet points of what they said in their final opportunity to address the jury?
So they started off, Chris, by pretty much saying, we hadn't heard this before earlier in the trial, saying Austin Metcalf had no authority to remove Karmelo Anthony from that tent. He had all the right to say, get off from under the tent, but he had no authority to physically move him, to make him move. He should have went and got a coach or something. That's what they were pretty much saying. So that was the initial highlight, and that was the whole narrative pretty much of their closing argument. And then, Chris, the biggest highlight to me towards the end, as they're trying to make headway with their closing argument here, was that we've heard about the hand in the bag situation with the phrasing, touch me and see what happens. What the defense attorney phrased or demonstrated, he was saying that he's giving the jury a scenario. And he was saying that if I have my hand in my bag and I tell you I have something in it, something potentially harmful, and I'm telling you to not touch me, you call my bluff saying I don't have anything in it, and then you touch me, and then I pull the thing out and use it, that was a warning and not provocation. So that's how they pretty much ended their closing argument, to which the prosecution got up to their rebuttal and said, do not let the defense turn a threat into a warning. That was the opening line. Do not let them turn a threat into a warning. And then they walked through these 4 distinct reasons as to why this wasn't a self-defense case. One of them was, provoking. You can't claim self-defense by, provoking a situation. And then when, the opposing party retaliates and then you do something bad, you can't claim self-defense with that. They talked about the immediate necessity for the use of force. How immediate was it? Were you really fearing for your life? Was there an opportunity to run? They talked about force disparity. And the prosecutor said that you could meet force with force, i.e. a shove with a shove. You can meet deadly force with deadly force, but you cannot meet normal force with lethal force. Pretty much showing one person had an edge up because they had a weapon while the other was unarmed. So they walked through a whole bunch of reasons as to why this was self-defense, Chris, and implored that, that the jury find Karmelo Anthony guilty, which now we know ultimately they did.
Yeah, and there were some strong words from the prosecution in those closing arguments. Like I have here that just, him bluntly saying, the prosecutor, you don't get to meet a shove with a stab, especially if you provoke the shove. And I feel like that was kind of, and might be saying something obvious, like really at the heart of this trial, because, a lot that the defense talked about was kind of pushing back on the tent culture part of it with the prosecution, where on the state side of it, it was, well, if you're a member of the opposing team, you don't go under a tent. And then the defense kind of pushed back on that, saying like, well, that wasn't really an unwritten rule that everybody knew. But then it's like you get to the point where they start having this altercation, and based off Texas law, when it comes to self-defense, like if you're the one with the weapon, it is really hard to argue that you were acting in self-defense. And we saw that play out with just how quickly the
Yeah.
jury reached this guilty verdict. I mean, 4 days of testimony, and I think it was what, less than 3 hours. That
Just under 3 hours.
Take me
Yeah.
through that part of it where, I know a lot of these, and you've covered big trials for Court TV, like where you're
Hmm.
waiting
Yeah.
days for
Yeah.
a verdict. And
Weeks.
this one came fast.
I mean, that's a testament to this whole trial, though, Chris. I mean, we've talked throughout this entire trial. 4 days of testimony, pedal to the metal, including a Saturday session, 9 hours a day, 40-minute lunch break, 10-minute afternoon break. I mean, we were in there. The jury working hard, media working hard, the families taking in all this, gruesome information in such a compacted time period, right? And the prosecution called their 21 witnesses. They rested on Saturday. The defense started immediately and got 3 witnesses in before the end of the day. We get back on Monday, yesterday, and then they call 3 witnesses. We go to lunch, and then there's this elongated delay to which we have no information about what's going on. We're thinking, oh, are they brokering a last minute plea deal? Are they preparing him to testify? We get back in there, and it's just the defense is rested. And it was kind of abrupt. There was kind of some head turning, like, oh, okay, that
Right.
and then the day ended, and then the state rested with no rebuttal. So all of that, Chris, just kind of a testament to how fast everything's going. Now, deliberations today, just under 3 hours. Deliberations before the sentencing, what the actual sentence was going to be after the conviction, just under 3 hours. They were getting this all done today, and we've been here all day. It's going on. It's past 8 o'clock Central Time here. So this was something that the judge was not really trying to delay in any capacity. I guess it felt like he wanted to just put a bow on it and move on to allow this community to heal on both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I mean, we've seen, murder cases, murder trials really get dragged out for a period of time. This was not one of them. I know we talked about like the sentencing part of it, and kind of that moment when it's announced that Carmelo Anthony is going to spend, potentially 35 years in prison. Prior to that, you just think of him entering today, and for this family, I'm sure they had hope that he was going to be found not guilty.
Hmm.
Everybody has opinions on how this trial went and how realistic that would have possibly been, but manslaughter was also on the table, and that's something that maybe gave them hope as well. Take us into the moment you get called back into the courtroom for the verdict on whether or not he was guilty of murder, and just what you remember about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was you could feel that there's this big moment coming, which, rightfully so it was. There's an imminence to it, right? And so we're all sitting in there, the media in the back row, the families come in. We saw Hunter Metcalf for the first time today in the courtroom. We know he did not testify. A lot of people were expecting that to maybe be, the final shebang in the prosecution's case. Let's hear from the decedent's twin brother. But he showed up in the courtroom today for the first time. He looked, kind of flush. He was there. He was with his mom and dad, looking very serious. The Anthony family came in, sat down. Of course, Carmelo's parents had their arms around each other, preparing to hear, the fate of their child. And so, of course, the defendant stands up and then guilty of murder. A lot of people, a lot of speculation online saw, an out with the manslaughter. Maybe he acted recklessly. Of course, we have a dead child over here, but maybe there wasn't enough premeditation. Maybe it was something in the moment, just, a horrible mistake. It happened to be the biggest mistake on earth, but maybe it was that. But this jury decided that no, there was intentionality. That's something that the prosecution harped on, intentionality by another human to take another human's life or cause bodily harm that will cause death. That's what the jury ultimately decided on. And of course, you just heard like an emotional drop on the Anthony side, but then kind of like a bit of release or a relief on the Metcalf side. So it was just that dichotomy of emotion in the courtroom. And then you saw Carmelo Anthony kind of drop his head, just seemingly in disbelief. And I'll walk you through it, Chris. So you get the whole, you've been reprimanded by the state. You're now in custody of the state. We know he's been out on bond this entire time for a year and some change. So he walks out, and then we immediately start to go into the penalty phase. And so he was out for a few minutes, and they walk him back in. And the way he was walking out, Chris, his back is to me when he's walking out. And his parents are right there to his right. I can't really see his face walking out, but when he comes back in, Chris, you can clearly see that he'd been crying, and he had this just bewildered facial expression, and his eyes were really wide, and his jaw was just hanging open. It is almost like it's real now, which of course has been real this whole time. But when you're out on bond, house arrest may not seem as real as I'm not going to be able to go back and give my mother a hug anymore, things like that. So I'm sure all of that weight the gravity of what's really settling in. Like this has happened. And when you're out on bond, leading up to the trial, you still have the hope. There's still the case hasn't been put on. I'm sure the hope, of course, was still there. And now, all hope is gone. And now he has to sit with that as an adult and deal with, the consequences of his actions as decided by this jury. But it was just a real, again, you could cut the tension with the butter knife inside that courtroom, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, you just think of, and I know, like, just from some of the notes, like his defense attorney had his arm around him, and
Hmm.
I'm sure that they've talked extensively about their strategy going into this trial, and you have this hope that um, that they came into this hoping that the way that they told their story would be a way that the jury would see it. But I mean, just for how quickly this jury looked and clearly, and we talked, I mean, it seems that the prosecution came in incredibly prepared for this trial.
Yeah.
They were ready on cross-examination. They had exhibits ready to go. Even in their responses to the closing arguments today, it just seemed like they had a lot ready to go.
Hmm.
And you saw that with roughly 3 hours for them to reach this, the jury to reach this guilty verdict. And part of it too, because I found it, I wasn't sure whether we were going to do the penalty phase tomorrow, and give
Hmm.
everybody a day with that. But I mean, not only did they go into the penalty phase really quickly, they put
Hmm.
Karmelo Anthony's mom on the stand, and it felt like within the hour of her son being found guilty of murder, she's there ultimately pleading to the jury to show mercy on him. It just seemed like so fast.
And Chris, I'll tell you, they didn't even give her a moment to breathe. They didn't give her a moment to sit with this. I mean, this is a mother also, right? This is a mother that's losing her son in a different way. And it was minutes. I don't think, all the days are running together, all the times running together now to going nonstop,
Yeah.
full throttle. But I think it was under half an hour. Carmela wasn't out of the room for very long. And then she was the only witness the defense called to the punishment phase, to the witness stand. And it was real brief. It was like under 3 minutes. And he pretty much asked her, the defense attorney, do you believe that your son regrets what he's done? And she just, I love my baby, I know my son. He's very, very sorry for what went down. And just really pleading that they show mercy on her son, which in retrospect, in a sense, they did. I mean, 35 years, that's a long time. That's tough to face at 19 years old. But there was an alternative of 99 years where he would never have gotten out. So in a sense, they did apply some leniency, but of course you can understand where staring 35 years down the barrel at 19 years old it's real tough, because that's not a short amount of time, right? But
No.
to your point though, Chris, she got on that stand within minutes, crying and just echoing through the speakers in that microphone, just all the emotion possible, essentially of a mother losing her son. So it was emotions on both sides. I mean, I can't implore that enough. It was just very, very, very emotional.
No. And I mean, you think too, for that family, no matter, how whatever you think of the verdict today, whatever you think of Carmelo Anthony, I just think of like that family, had their
Hmm.
son. He was going to a track meet middle of the day on a Wednesday, I think it was in April of last year, and then they get a phone call that this had happened. I mean, very different
Hmm.
situation than the Metcalf family that also received
Right.
a horrific phone call. But to just think that they're in this room going through this, and then here she is on the stand, just with the blistering pace that this judge went with. Like, I was surprised that was something where just so quickly, without even really having the time to, I'm sure, process everything, you're on the stand.
Hmm.
And just kind of looking at the notes too, because the state did speak to her. These prosecutors that, ultimately they presented a case and found her son guilty of murder. What was that moment like, where you have one of these prosecutors then talking to her as she is
Hmm.
emotional on the stand, asking for mercy for her son?
He spoke for, it was like a sentence, maybe two, Chris, maybe a sentence and a half. He's kind of looked at her and said, "You're grieving as a mother would," understanding where that emotion is coming from. And he pretty much just said, "You will still be involved in your son's life." And that's pretty much all he said. And then he passed the witness back to the defense, which, in a sense, of course, I mean, you say that, what he's trying to get at is that she'll still get to see her son, because one of the most powerful moments during their closing argument, Chris, the prosecution's, or during the sentencing, before they went back to do the sentencing, when he was considering the punishment. The prosecutors really hammering on, sending a message to the community. Community was a big word they were harping on, holding people accountable in the community to make your community what you want it to be. And he talked about, considering life sentences. And he had a real bellowing voice. The defense attorney was a little more soft spoken, but the prosecutor he echoed throughout the courtroom when he was getting emotional, right? And so he was like, when you're considering life sentences, Jeff Metcalf, Megan Metcalf, Hunter Metcalf all have life sentences, a life sentence of a void in their home and a void in their heart. I thought that was a very powerful, a powerful, way to express that, because while we talk about Carmelo Anthony being gone a long time, essentially there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a very long tunnel, but there is a light. But what the prosecution was getting at is that there is no light for the Metcalf family. Austin Metcalf will never come back, no matter how much attempts at healing and whatever else they have to go through, or counseling or consoling, whatever amongst themselves, whatever they have to do to make themselves, better to go on in life. He still will never come back. And that's what the prosecution was harping on here, which to me kind of made it insurmountable. I mean, how do you overcome that with a defense strategy, any kind of closing argument, any kind of plea for leniency, right? So again, that's to the point we've been talking about. It seemed like the prosecution was just prepared with every single phrasing, every single cross-examination, every single, direct examination under their case. They came in this, just readily prepared for every possible scenario.
I think of the jurors too, and like you can't like lose sight of the fact that these are people like all of us, where you get the jury summons for jury duty in the mail, and you're like, oh, I can't believe I have to go do this,
Yeah.
and then you end up showing up hoping they're going to send you home, and then eventually you work your way through and you find yourself in that jury box, and then you realize it is going to be for a case that was getting a lot of attention in the Dallas area, and then you find yourself not only determining guilt or innocence and kind of handling that weight. I mean, and you think of like jury selection was like Monday last week.
Yeah.
Like when all of this happened, like to think like 2 weeks ago, nobody knew that they would be in this position. And then here they are also determining the penalty phase of it. Just what did you take away from this jury, kind of looking at them, kind of understanding what they had to go through over the past several days, and then certainly today with their verdict of guilty for Karmelo Anthony? And then you think about having to determine, I mean, to have such a wide range too, of 5 to 99 years, and to go through a deliberation to figure out exactly what the right punishment would be.
Yeah, and I got, as I've been speaking on it the past few days, Chris, they've just been there's emotion at the beginning of the trial, of course, when you're hearing 911 calls, when you're hearing all this emotional testimony and seeing body cam footage of compressions being done in this dying body. Of course, there was emotion at that point. But when all that passed, they were just, real attentive to everything each side had to say, because they had to take all that information in and essentially make what they believed was a fair decision as far as the guilt. And then to me, what was probably, the harder decision, the penalty, the punishment here. Because like you said, why 5 to 99, that's a huge scale to choose from, and then to ultimately land on 35, which maybe it's because of his age, maybe they wanted to give him another chance at life down the road. But you look at them there, and they came back in, and they just looked, like they looked like a jury that had their mind made up. They looked like there was no fluctuation in their decision making. They looked like they took all the information in that that was necessary to take in to make these incredibly heavy decisions. That's something that the prosecution and defense were harping on during closing arguments for both, the guilt phase and the penalty phase, was that they understand the task at hand, this tall task, for this jury to be here, listen to all this, emotional, testimony, see all these exhibits, look out into the gallery and see the emotion going on, and then having to be tasked with, dealing with a young man that's sitting over there in that defendant's table. So, they looked like they were, prepared for the task at hand.
Yeah, and I just think too, I mean, and there will be people who will criticize the defense attorney, and that's a really tough job, right? I mean, you got to have a stomach to have that line of work, deal with the pressure, and putting everything together. Just what did you take away from his defense in terms of just the body language you saw in that moment, where I'm sure you work incredibly hard to put a trial together, it doesn't go your way, and then you're in this situation where, I'm sure there's, in hindsight, would you have done things differently? I don't know. You'll face a ton of criticism. And just what did you take away from his defense attorney with just his body language dealing with, from their point of view, a very, very difficult day?
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine when you take on this case, Chris, the facts of this case are insanely just, they're tough. They're insurmountable facts, especially when you have something like Carmelo Anthony on body cam admitting to the stabbing. I mean, we've already got that. That's there. So, when you take on this case, it's just a difficult case in the beginning, right? To try to formulate and strategize. And I can't even imagine what goes into even trying to attempt to defend a case like this. And of course, once the decision came down today, you're hired to try to keep this defendant from behind bars, right? And then you get a sentence like this. I'd imagine there's a feeling of being unsuccessful, and so he's standing there. He has his arm around Karmelo. He's kind of like leaning with him, leaning into him, giving him, consoling him, I would say. I don't want to say there was a sense of defeat because they put their best foot forward, obviously with the hand they were dealt, but it was a somber echoing of body language there in the court as they listened to the prosecution put on their closing argument. When they listened to what the jury came back with both verdicts, just a real just taking it in, like, we tried and this is the result. And he verbally said that he respected the decisions that the jury made, because in this country we operate on due process. Everyone's due to a fair trial, and he acknowledged that and just had to respect the decision.
Yeah, and Karmelo Anthony found guilty in the murder of Austin Metcalf, 35 years in Texas State Prison. Cody Thomas with Court TV, you did an amazing job covering this trial. Cameras were not allowed. Audio recording was not allowed. And you just did a great job painting the picture for us in what was a very, very difficult case for so many people.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Chris. And I thank you for having me every night to give the people the updates in there, because, transparency inside a courtroom is very important for public perception. So I was happy to do it. And I thank you for having me on here so I can relay this information to the world.
Yeah. And just a tough case. That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. And we're also now streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.